I never wanted your money. I only wanted this family to accept me.
Accept you? You'll never belong in this family.
I've done everything I could.
Can wear expensive dresses.
That's enough, Mother.
Julian, please.
No. Today, everyone is finally going to hear the truth.
Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, back to the story. The wine was still dripping down the front of her dress when the room went quiet enough to hear it. 300 guests sat frozen in their seats, crystal glasses halfway to their lips, watching a woman named Angela Cole stand perfectly still at the head table of her own anniversary gala while a stain the color of blood spread across white silk. She did not gasp. She did not reach for a napkin. Her hands stayed folded in front of her, steady, and her eyes locked on the woman across the table who had just called her a mistake in front of everyone who mattered in Atlanta. Margaret Cole was still mid-sentence, her champagne glass raised like she was toasting a wedding instead of ending one. "Some women marry up," she said, letting the words settle over the ballroom like she'd rehearsed them, which she had. "And some women marry a lawsuit waiting to happen." A few guests laughed before they caught themselves. Most just stared at Angela, waiting to see if she would cry, or scream, or run. She did none of those things. She simply stood there, 5 years of quiet dignity holding her spine straight, while the woman who raised her husband smiled at her like she'd finally won something. What nobody in that ballroom understood, not the board members whispering behind their hands, not the society wives already reaching for their phones, not even Margaret herself standing there so sure of her own victory, was that the man seated at the head of that table had spent the last 6 months finding out exactly what kind of woman his mother really was. Julian Cole had said almost nothing all evening. He would not stay silent much longer. 6 months before that night, nobody at that table knew what Julian Cole had already found out. To understand what happened at that dinner, you have to go back further than 6 months. You have to go back 9 years, to a hospital in a small Georgia town most of the people in that ballroom had never heard of, where a 26-year-old ICU nurse named Angela Price worked double shifts to help pay off her mother's medical bills. She kept a thermos with a dented lid on her station desk and a photograph of her mother taped inside her locker, and she had a rule she never broke, which was that she never let a patient lie there believing nobody was paying attention to whether they lived or died. That rule was tested on a Tuesday night in October when a car accident on the interstate brought in a young man with internal bleeding and a head injury, so severe the surgeon on call gave him even odds. His name was Julian Cole, though nobody in that hospital knew yet that the name meant anything. His family arrived within hours, but they did not gather at his bedside. They gathered in the family conference room down the hall, arguing over emergency provisions in a trust document while their son lay in a coma 11 doors away. And it was Angela who noticed, on day 6, that the overnight team had missed the early signs of an infection creeping into his blood. She caught it because she stayed an hour past her shift to read his chart twice, something she did for every patient whose family she suspected wasn't really watching. She flagged the infection to the attending physician herself, pushed until someone listened, and spent the following 4 nights adjusting his antibiotics and talking to him in a low voice even though the machine said he couldn't hear a word. She told him about her mother's garden. She told him which nurses on the floor gossiped and which ones you could actually trust. She had no idea that the man in that bed owned 3 hotels and half a shopping district in downtown Atlanta, and if she had known, it would not have changed a single thing she did. He woke up on the 11th day, and the first face he saw clearly was hers, tired, kind, unimpressed by anything except whether his oxygen levels were holding steady. He would later tell her that everyone else who visited him that week wanted to know about the company. She was the only person who wanted to know if the pain in his ribs was a 7 or an 8. That difference, small as it sounds, was the beginning of everything Margaret Cole would spend the next several years trying to undo. By the time Julian was discharged, His family had already drawn their conclusions about the nurse who'd been sitting at his bedside more than any of them had, and none of those conclusions were kind. Margaret arrived at the hospital only twice during his recovery, both times dressed for a board meeting rather than a bedside, and both times she looked at Angela the way a person looks at a stain they intend to have removed. She did not ask Angela's name. She asked the charge nurse, in a voice meant to carry, whether hospital staff were permitted to spend that much unsupervised time alone with patients from families like theirs. Angela heard it. She said nothing, because saying something had never once fixed anything for a woman in her position, and because Julian, still weak, still relearning how to walk across a room, was the one person in that building who had never once made her feel like the help. 2 years later, after a courtship that unfolded almost entirely outside the reach of Atlanta society, in diners and community clinics, and the kind of places where nobody recognized his last name, they married in a small courthouse ceremony with 11 guests. Margaret was invited. Margaret did not come, and sent a card instead that congratulated her son on his generosity. That word, generosity, was the first small cut of many. It suggested that whatever Angela had married into, she had not earned, and that whatever Julian felt for her was charity rather than love. Angela kept working, first full-time at the same hospital, later part-time at a free clinic near her old neighborhood, long after the money made it unnecessary. She told friends it wasn't about proving anything to Margaret. Deep down, everyone who knew her understood that it was, at least a little, and that every 12-hour shift she picked up was its own quiet answer to a woman who had never once asked her name. Margaret had her reasons for the silence, and they had very little to do with hospitals or last names. The Cole family fortune sat inside a trust established by Julian's late father, and that trust carried a single clause that mattered more to Margaret than any wedding ever could. Full control would pass to Julian on his 35th birthday, a date that was now less than a year away, and once that transfer happened, Margaret's seat on the foundation board, her access to the discretionary accounts, and her say over every acquisition the family made would exist only because Julian allowed it. For 9 years, she had managed to keep her son close enough to influence and far enough from Angela that the marriage never felt permanent in Atlanta's eyes. The clock she had been watching quietly for a decade was finally running out. Gerald Finch had served as the family's attorney for over 20 years, long enough to know which requests for Margaret Cole were business and which ones were something closer to war. When she called him in March, 8 months before the anniversary gala, and asked him to locate someone from the Georgia hospital where Angela used to work, someone with a grievance, someone whose story could be shaped into something useful, he understood exactly what kind of request that was. He raised no objection. He had learned long ago that objecting to Margaret cost more than it saved, and within 6 weeks he had found a woman named Patricia Owens, whose father had died in that same hospital during the years Angela worked there, under a different nurse's care entirely, a detail Margaret decided was a technicality rather than a problem. Patricia was not a cruel woman by nature. She was a woman drowning in medical bills for her own mother's care, approached by a lawyer offering more money than she had seen in years in exchange for a story that required only a little bending of facts she barely remembered correctly herself. She told herself the woman being accused was rich now, insulated, that whatever discomfort the story caused would pass quickly for someone married into that kind of money. She did not yet understand that reputations, once poisoned in a room full of powerful people, rarely recover on anyone's timeline but the poisoners. She signed paperwork she did not fully read, and Gerald Finch filed it away until Margaret decided the timing was right. While all of this moved quietly in the background, Julian had begun pulling away from conversations he used to have easily with his wife, and Angela noticed it long before she understood why. He started staying later at the office. He asked strange, specific questions about hospital billing systems, about how patient records were stored, about whether a family member could request access to an old file without the hospital's knowledge. He kept a locked drawer in his study that he had never locked before. Angela assumed, in the quiet way people assumed the worst about the people they love most, that something had shifted between them, that the ease of the last 5 years was thinning into something more careful and less certain. She did not know that Julian had started that drawer the week his mother made an offhand comment at a business dinner about handling the optics problem before the transfer, a phrase that meant nothing to anyone else at that table, but stopped Julian mid-bite. He had grown up watching his mother handle problems his entire life, and he knew from decades of experience that when Margaret used the word handle, someone else usually ended up paying for it. He hired a private investigator that same month, a quiet, careful man who specialized in financial trails rather than affairs, and told nobody, not even Angela, because he needed proof before he brought his suspicion to the one person who deserved to hear it least of anyone, which was his own wife. The anniversary gala had been on the calendar for over a year, planned initially as a straightforward celebration of 5 years of marriage, and, more usefully for the family's image, a public reaffirmation of the Cole name ahead of the trust transfer. Margaret had pushed for a guest list heavier on board members and society columnists than actual friends, and Julian, distracted by what his investigator was slowly uncovering, had let her handle most of the details without a fight. Angela spent weeks choosing a dress in a soft ivory that reminded her of nothing fashionable at all, just a color her mother used to wear to church, and she told Julian the week before that she felt nervous walking into a room full of people who had never fully accepted her. He told her that night, holding her hands across the kitchen table, that whatever happened at that dinner, she needed to trust that he saw her clearly even when it seemed like he wasn't looking. She thought he meant it as comfort for her nerves about the crowd. She had no idea he was already holding bank records that traced a payment from a Shell account to a woman named Patricia Owens, dated the same week Margaret had made her comment about optics. He had learned enough by then to know something was coming. He did not yet know it would arrive in the middle of dinner, in front of 300 people, with a glass of red wine as the opening move. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of Georgia humidity that clings to silk and makes chandeliers feel warmer than they should. Guests filled the ballroom in waves, board members trading quiet handshakes, society wives comparing jewelry with practiced glances, and Angela moved through the room the way she always did at these events, polite, warm to the waitstaff in a way that made the old money crowd faintly uncomfortable, careful never to let anyone see how tightly she was holding herself together. Margaret watched her from across the room with the calm satisfaction of a woman who believed she had already won, unaware that her own son had spent 6 months building a case against her that would come due before dessert was served. Patricia Owens arrived at the gala on Gerald Finch's arm, introduced to the handful of board members who mattered as a distant family friend from out of state, a detail vague enough that nobody thought to question it twice. She wore a dress Margaret's assistant had picked out for her, expensive enough to blend into the room, and she spent the first hour near the bar with a drink she barely touched, rehearsing in her head the version of events she had agreed to tell. Every so often her eyes found Angela across the ballroom, and each time they did, something in her chest tightened in a way the money had not prepared her for. She had imagined this moment as a transaction, standing 30 feet from the woman she was about to accuse of something that never happened. It felt like something closer to a betrayal she hadn't fully priced in. Dinner began the way these dinners always began, with waitstaff moving in practiced silence, and conversations settling into the comfortable rhythm of people who had known each other for decades pretending to be interested in each other's children. Angela sat beside Julian at the head table, close enough to feel the tension in his hand whenever she reached for it under the tablecloth, though she still believed that tension belonged to nerves about hosting rather than anything more specific. Margaret sat across from them, radiant in a way that unsettled the few guests who knew her well enough to recognize it as the look she wore right before she got exactly what she wanted. Gerald Finch kept checking his watch. Patricia kept staring at her plate, The first toast came from a board member, harmless and forgettable, followed by a cousin's joke about Julian's driving that pulled polite laughter from the tables nearest the front. Angela allowed herself, for the first time that evening, to relax slightly into her chair, thinking perhaps the night would pass the way she had hoped it would, uneventful, forgettable. Another box checked in the long project of being accepted by people who had decided against her before they ever met her. She did not notice Margaret rising until the room had already begun to quiet in anticipation, the way a crowd quiets instinctively when it senses something is about to matter. Margaret's toast began exactly the way everyone expected, warm remarks about her son's business instincts, a joke about how proud his late father would have been to see the company thriving under his direction, gentle laughter rippling through the tables. Angela clapped along with everyone else, still unaware that the warmth was scaffolding for something else entirely, built carefully over the last 20 minutes the way a lawyer builds an opening argument before the jury realizes what case is actually being made. Then Margaret's tone shifted, subtle at first, a slight cooling around the edges of her voice as she began speaking about family, about legacy, about the responsibility that comes with a name like Cole, and about how far, she said, this family has had to stretch its idea of who belongs at this table. She turned then, deliberately, toward Patricia and asked her to stand and share what she called a story the room deserved to hear before any transfer of trust could move forward in good conscience. Patricia rose on unsteady legs, gripping the back of her chair, and began speaking in a voice that shook more from guilt than nerves, describing a father who died in a Georgia hospital under circumstances she called neglect, describing a nurse who she said had been careless, distracted, more interested in charming a wealthy patient down the hall than doing her actual job. She never said Angela's name directly. She did not need to. Every eye in that ballroom had already turned toward the head table, and Angela felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her even as she kept her spine straight and her hands folded, refusing to give the room the reaction it was hungry for. That refusal seemed to irritate Margaret more than tears would have, and she pressed further, raising her glass as if toasting a wedding rather than ending one, delivering the line she had clearly rehearsed for weeks about women who marry up and women who marry a lawsuit waiting to happen. It was in that exact moment, as laughter rippled uncertainly through the tables and cameras quietly rose from a few curious hands, that a server passing behind Angela's chair lost his balance against another guest's outstretched arm, sending a full glass of red wine across the white silk covering her chest. Nobody in that room, least of all Margaret, understood yet that the accident was the only honest thing that happened in that entire toast, and that everything Margaret believed she had orchestrated was about to unravel far faster than she had planned for. The wine spread across white silk exactly the way blood spreads across snow, sudden, undeniable, drawing every eye in the ballroom back to the woman at the center of the humiliation Margaret had spent months constructing. Angela did not flinch. She did not reach for a napkin, did not glance toward the server stammering apologies behind her, did not give Margaret the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in front of 300 witnesses. She simply sat there, dress ruined, dignity intact, while whispers moved through the room like something alive, guests leaning toward each other, phones rising a little higher, waiting to see what would happen next in a moment that already felt too perfect to be entirely accidental, though nobody yet suspected how wrong that assumption truly was. Julian had been quiet through most of the toast, his jaw tight, his hand resting flat against his thigh in a way Angela had learned over 5 years to recognize as a man forcing himself to wait. He was not waiting out of weakness. He had spent 6 months gathering exactly this moment, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who had watched his mother operate his entire life, that reacting too early would only give her room to reframe whatever came next. So he let the wine spill happen. He let the laughter ripple. He let Margaret believe, for exactly as long as she needed to believe it, that she had already won the room, because a woman that confident makes mistakes a woman still fighting never would. When Julian finally rose from his chair, he did it slowly, without drama, the way a man stands when he has rehearsed a moment so many times in his head that his body no longer needs instructions. The room quieted immediately, not because he raised his voice, but because everyone in that ballroom understood on some instinctive level that the real toast of the evening had not yet been given. He did not look at his mother first. He looked at Patricia Owens, still standing awkwardly near her chair, her hands trembling around the stem of a glass she had not touched all night, and he asked her, gently enough that it startled people expecting anger, whether she was aware that hospital records from that period showed her father had never once been assigned to Angela's unit. Patricia's face changed before she said a single word, and that change told the room more than any document could have. Julian continued, calm in a way that unsettled people more than shouting would have, explaining that he had spent recent months reviewing old hospital billing records, personnel schedules, and shift logs from the exact period in question, all of it obtained legally through channels his own attorney could verify if anyone at that table wanted to challenge him on it. He explained, without raising his voice, that the payment which funded Patricia's appearance that evening had originated from an account established 8 months earlier, the very same month his mother had first mentioned handling what she called an optics problem ahead of the trust transfer scheduled for his upcoming birthday. A sound moved through the crowd that was not quite gasping and not quite silence, something closer to 300 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the family hosting them. Margaret's expression, so composed only moments earlier, tightened at the corners in a way she could not fully control, though she said nothing yet, perhaps still believing she could redirect the room the way she always had. Julian did not give her the chance. He turned to face her directly for the first time since standing, and told the room, in a voice that carried the particular steadiness of a man who had waited far too long to say something true, that this was not the first time his mother had rearranged facts to protect what she believed she was owed. He described, carefully, a night 9 years earlier, long before Angela ever entered any of their lives, when his own father lay in a hospital bed requiring an emergency transfer to a specialized cardiac unit 2 hours away, a transfer that needed a single signature from whoever held medical proxy at that hour. Margaret held that proxy. Records obtained through the investigation showed a delay of nearly 90 minutes between the recommendation and her signature, a gap she had explained at the time as confusion over hospital paperwork. Julian said he had believed that explanation for years, the way children believe explanations from parents they trust, until his investigator uncovered a call log, placing her on a business line negotiating a hotel acquisition during the exact window in question, unwilling to step out of the deal to authorize a transfer that might have saved her husband's life. The ballroom had gone entirely silent by then, the kind of silence that exists only in rooms where something irreversible has just been said aloud in front of too many witnesses to take back. Margaret's hand tightened around the stem of her glass, her knuckles pale against the crystal, and for the first time all evening she did not have a rehearsed line ready. Board members exchanged glances that had nothing to do with Angela anymore, and everything to do with recalculating whether the woman they had trusted with the foundation for 9 years was the same woman Julian had just described. Angela sat perfectly still beside her husband, wine drying against silk, watching the room turn its attention away from her humiliation and toward a truth far larger than anything Margaret had ever accused her of. Margaret did not speak again for the rest of that dinner. She simply stood there, glass still in hand, watching decades of careful control dissolve in front of the exact audience she had built her entire reputation around impressing. Board members who had spent years deferring to her judgment on the foundation now found themselves whispering to each other in tones that had shifted overnight from respect to calculation, each of them silently reconsidering every decision she had championed, every account she had overseen without much oversight of her own. Gerald Finch, seated near the back, slid his phone into his pocket and did not meet anyone's eyes for the remainder of the evening, already understanding that his years of quiet compliance had just become considerably more dangerous to his own career than he had ever allowed himself to consider. Patricia Owens left the ballroom before dessert was served, slipping out a side entrance without saying goodbye to anyone, including the attorney who had recruited her. She sat in her car in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes before she could bring herself to drive, replaying the look on Angela's face when the truth came out. A look that held no cruelty in it at all, only something closer to exhaustion. 2 days later, she called Angela directly, her voice breaking almost immediately, explaining the medical bills piling up for her own mother's care and the desperation that made a lawyer's offer feel like the only door still open to her. Angela listened without interrupting, and when Patricia finished, she asked only one question: whether her mother currently had adequate care, because that, she said, was the only part of this story that still mattered to her. Within a week, Angela had connected Patricia's mother with a case manager at the free clinic where she still volunteered, arranging a payment plan and a specialist referral that Patricia could never have secured on her own. She did this quietly, without press, without asking anything from Patricia in return, and when word of it eventually reached the same society circles that had watched her humiliated at that dinner, it did more to restore her standing than any public statement or lawsuit ever could have. People who had whispered about her for years found themselves without anything left to whisper, because the woman they had tried to shrink into a punchline had responded to real cruelty with the same steady decency she had shown a stranger in a hospital bed 9 years earlier. The foundation board moved against Margaret within 3 weeks, not through scandal or public pressure, but through the quiet mechanics of an institution finally examining its own books closely for the first time in years. The shell account that had funded Patricia's appearance led investigators to 2 other transactions Margaret had authorized under similarly vague justifications, both of them personal expenses disguised as foundation spending. She was asked to step down from her position before the story could spread any further than it already had, and she did so without a public fight, understanding better than anyone in that room that a woman who built her power on control could not survive losing it in front of witnesses. Julian did not attend the meeting where she was removed. He said he had already said what he needed to say, and the rest was not his to referee. The trust transferred to Julian on his 35th birthday exactly as scheduled, quietly, without the fanfare his mother had once imagined surrounding it. And one of his first decisions as full owner of the family's holdings was to add Angela's name to the foundation's medical outreach committee, a role she had never asked for and initially resisted, until she realized how much good could move through an institution finally freed from the person who had spent years hoarding its resources for appearances. She used that position to expand the free clinic's funding into 2 additional counties within the first year, a fact that never made it into any society column, though it changed considerably more lives than any headline about her marriage ever had. Months later, Julian and Angela held a small second ceremony, not at any of the ballrooms his mother had once favored, but at the free clinic itself, surrounded by the nurses she had worked beside for years and the handful of relatives who had actually shown up for her when it mattered rather than when it was convenient. Margaret was not invited, and no one at that gathering seemed to notice her absence. The following morning, Angela was back in scrubs, checking a chart, indistinguishable from any other nurse on shift, exactly as she had always insisted she wanted to remain. Some women marry up, and some women marry a lawsuit waiting to happen, Margaret had said that night in front of 300 witnesses. She had been wrong about which one Angela was. She had simply married someone who finally stood up.